Welcome to the Elephant in the Room with Bradley Devlin. I, of course, am Bradley Devlin. Whether you're joining us on Apple Music, ooh, I know that's new, and Google Play, ooh, another new option for you, or SoundCloud or Spotify, thank you for joining us at work, in the car, at home, hanging out with friends and family. We really do appreciate it. Now, we've got a lot to get to. This one's going to be a bit longer. I tell you off the bat, it's going to be longer, so bear with us. But we've got a lot of information for you, and that's why we are going to jump right in. So for this week's segment of Campus Craziness, we did this in 2019, right? Fall 2019, 10 craziest college courses being offered. Well, now we're doing crazy spring 2020 courses as the new semester heats back up. So here is our top 10 craziest college courses for spring 2020. Coming in at number 10, we have Global Feminist Theory from Oregon State University. It explores the connections between women's religious experiences around the world and the global problems addressed by feminist theology and spirituality. At number 9, it's Coffee 101, Coffee and its History for the Average Joe, Oberlin Experimental College. Now, this course seeks to examine the history and relevance of one of the most popular drinks of all time, coffee, and its environmental and sociological ramifications. Number 8 is courtesy of Providence College, and it's called The Power of Whiteness. Historical development of whiteness within the context of colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and globalization and their aftermaths as a way of understanding the cultural environments and processes of ethno-racial and gender sexual identity formation today. Hegemonic whiteness is deconstructed and challenged. Whiteness is examined as an unnamed, unmarked category. Whites are just normal. That carries powers and privileges. Ooh, yikes. That would be... I mean, I'll get into my full analysis of what all these classes have in common. How much of that course description is accessible to the American people? Hardly any of it. And that's just a testament to current academia's arrogance and attitude that they share towards the majority of individuals. Number 7 is Themes and Masculinities from the University of Missouri, and it explores how male experiences are shaped by gender expectations and social context, with emphasis on psychosocial challenges and privileges associated with negotiating masculine gender role expectations. Evaluates the psychological impact of gender, especially in American pop culture, on diverse men and their families. Studies how gender interacts with other aspects of identity such as race, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and non-conforming gender identity. Good old intersectionality. I mean, the modern day college education and high school education really wouldn't be complete without it. Gosh, what a dunderheaded ideology, which I'll get to in a minute. Number 6 is the Mueller Investigation and Beyond at Stetson University Law School. This course promises to examine the appointment of special counsel Robert Mueller and the indictments, criminal information, plea agreements, and other legal documents and cases coming from this investigation. Now, this is on its face, it's not a crazy course, but it is crazy that it's being taught by Professor Ellen Podor, who previously expressed doubt about the validity of Trump's win in the 2016 election and has openly questioned the accuracy of the results through blog posts that she maintains on a regular basis. And though this course claims it will focus strictly on law and not be obstructed by any particular political slant, do you really think that's what's going to happen here? I doubt it. Number 5 is Food Justice from Oregon State University. My goodness, Oregon State University is like the Florida man of crime when it comes to crazy college courses. I mean, they should be all over this list, and they are for good reason. So Food Justice studies contemporary food systems, and they examine these food systems from a cultural and social justice perspective. The human right to food as recognized by the United Nations, the the provider of all rights, and the actualizer of things like food and water and shelter. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Oh, there's a homeless man in my backyard in Berkeley right now. I mean, all seriousness, it doesn't matter what the United Nations says about rights. Yeah, sure, a bunch of countries ratified what they believe, but when it comes down to it, no one really meets the UN's expectations because they're idealistic, and that's partially the purpose of the United Nations, is not to be any governing authority. It's just to set the ultimate ideals, as some bureaucrats would say, on where society should be headed. Anyway, these UN rights serves as the food justice grounding point. Impediments to realizing the right to food will be examined in national and international contexts. Number 4, Sexualities and International Relations from Amherst College. Sexuality, Women's and Gender Studies provides an interdisciplinary cross-cultural exploration of how the categories of women, gender, and sexuality are constructed, understood, and reproduced historically and in the present. It is also an inquiry into women's material, cultural, and economic productions, their self-descriptions, and their collective undertakings. I can't wait to see what they think about Margaret Thatcher in that class. The Iron Lady, one of the best female political leaders in human history. Doubt that they will give her glowing reviews whatsoever. Number 3, beginning belly dancing at the University of South Carolina. Well, congratulations. You're paying $30,000 to go to the University of South Carolina a year, and you took belly dancing. Wow. Congratulations. Snaps for you. Wow. Yeah, instead of complying with state requirements dictating the school should offer a course in the Constitution, the University of South Carolina will teach belly dancing instead. And despite the state requiring students to be educated about the founding documents of their country while in college, University of South Carolina has declined to offer such a course. The former University of South Carolina President Harris Pastides has insisted that the students have learned enough about the Constitution through voluntary courses, so beginning belly dancing will be offered instead. I love the current state of academia. My goodness. I swear, I have garbage in my garbage can right now in my frat house fraternity room where I record this show. That's going to be worth more than my diploma when this is all said and done. Number 2 is Angry White Male Studies from the University of Kentucky, and it contexts feminism, racism, homosexuality, and transgenderism, analyzing manifestations of male anger. This course fulfills a humanities requirement by delving deep into the rise of angry white men in the 1950s. Really? White men? You mean the people that you blame for enslaving people for, like, I don't know, 400 or 500 years? That angry white male just developed in the 1950s. I mean, come on, guys. If you're gonna have a course on this, go full out. I want really sink your teeth into the white male if you're gonna do it over at the University of Kentucky. And now, number 1, Queering God, Swarthmore College. This course attempts to dissect feminist and queer writing about the God of the Bible. It questions the notion of God being referred to as he, and if his nurturing and forgiving traits render him feminine or female. The students will also be able to analyze God's gender identity. Wow. They're really willing to misgender God. I mean, God forbid if I accidentally call a dude who puts a wig on a he. They're gonna fully attempt to assume God's gender, something that they probably know nothing about, given that these people are 90% atheists in this class over at Swarthmore College. But now let's get to my analysis on the top 10 craziest college courses being offered this semester, and let's draw a consistent and coherent line between all of these courses. What do they all have in common? And what does that tell us about the current state of American institutions of higher education and the academic so-called elites heading them up? Notice that these courses aren't focused on building valuable or practical skills or make students learn in basic American civics or even education in the Greek sense, right? Self-actualization grounded in any real sense of reality or human nature. Part of it is universities trying to be hip and give more pop culture education options, or classes that mirror an all-inclusive resort or a cruise ship rather than universities, as universities move more and more and more into the hospitality industry for their students. The other is the nature of these academics that head up these institutions themselves. They're vain, they're conceited, they're snobby, and they believe they're all so above it all. So above you, so above your peers, and even so above their students in some cases that they're willing to buy into each other's pseudo-profound bullcrap just because it's angsty and runs against whatever normative version of history they claim is contributing to the collapse of society or preventing its progress. That's why all of these courses are primarily centered in critical theory or trying to find subliminal messages or dog whistles throughout history in order to create their own fictitious history in an attempt to retrofit their worldview to these topics and make it appear coherent, which then allows them to cram it down on all of their students. These universities are hindering the education of their students by not providing them with real courses that respect the potential of their growing minds. Instead, pop culture and the political biases of these campus professors are being prioritized over valuable education that talk about civics and human nature, and courses that will further foster a deep understanding of America and its founding. Parents and taxpayers should know that their money is going towards funding these types of courses, and it's imperative that we reevaluate where our current college education system is leading students. It's leading them to chase rainbows of liberalism and then they come to the end of the rainbow and find no pot of gold sitting there, which leaves them empty, with no purpose, unfulfilled, depressed, and lonely. Because belly dancing and queer theories about the gender identity of God do little to impress upon college students the need to understand their system of government, human nature, and the world that they live in the 21st century, it prevents these students from generating real-life skill sets, marketable skill sets, for the rest of their lifetime. These bizarre courses, while funny and a great little bit for my podcast, should be cause for real concern, and it's time for the American college system to truly be re-examined. Before we hop into Bradley's breakdown talking about the New York Times double endorsement of two women for president, I'm going to tell you about YAF's on-campus lectures happening in the near future at colleges, hopefully near you, so you can attend for free, just like all of YAF's lectures on college campuses. So on January 28th at 7 p.m., Rachel Campos Duffy will be speaking at Florida State University in the Globe. Again, a free event, and make sure to check that out if you're in the Florida State area. Also, on January 31st at 3 p.m., Steve Forbes will be speaking at the University of South Carolina. No, I refuse to call it USC. That's not the real USC. USC's out here on my coast. But anyway, go check out Steve Forbes at the University of South Carolina on January 31st. Also, on February 3rd at 7 p.m., Alicia Krause, the lovely Alicia Krause from the Daily Wire, will be speaking at Texas Christian University, TCU, in Winston-Scott 228. So if you are at or around any of these schools, make sure to check these free on-campus lectures out and visit www.yaf.org/events for more information. Also, if you are in the Nashville area or are interested in going to a conference, check out Young America's Foundation's Freedom Conference in Nashville on February 7th. That is at the Gaylord Opryland Resort and Convention Center. So make sure to check that out. Again, that's yaf.org/events for more information on all these campus lectures and so many more coming up as we heat up this spring 2020 semester. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into Bradley's breakdown. So you may have heard on Sunday evening, the New York Times editorial board announced it would do something groundbreaking, something unexpected, something unprecedented. Yes, in the 2020 election, the New York Times would endorse not just one, but two Democratic candidates for president, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Of course, this is especially noteworthy due to the fact that the paper's endorsement of Senator Warren and Senator Klobuchar comes just 2 weeks before the Iowa caucuses on February 3rd, the first bout in the Democratic 2020 primaries. Now, luckily, America was too busy watching playoff football to really give a damn. Not like they gave a damn in the first place, because they know the New York Times is full of crawling Ivy-educated New York socialites turned oh-so-brave journalistic watchdogs in their news department, and opinion writers that are Karl Marx wannabes, pseudo-intellectuals that believe the world would be a whole lot better if it was just run, but not only run, but controlled and even micromanaged by people like them. Just like the European Union, which is probably why they venerate the Europeans and their failing social safety nets so much and disdain America. Anyway, their long oak table conference rooms on the 30-some-odd floor in their high-rise in New York City must reek of their own self-importance. And their hubris from this commanding height has only left them scratching their heads, wondering how they can control the commanding heights. Think I'm being too harsh? I don't. Imagine the arrogance it takes to make an hour-long reality show-esque special dedicated to your intense deliberations on telling the American people how they ought to vote, not only in the primary, but in the general election. And after promising such a great and big reveal, they failed to come to the answer they had promised. Deliver the American people an answer to all of their problems wrapped up into one Democratic candidate that would be a godsend. Don't you see, folks? The entertainment and pleasure wasn't to give you an answer of who to vote for. It was to show you how incredibly brilliant and diverse and educated and eloquent the editorial board is over at the New York Times. So, let's get into the meat of this piece that endorses both Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. What should a split endorsement for the first time in the paper's history tell you instantly? A divided editorial board. The Times said in their analysis that the similarities between the platforms of progressive Democrats embodied by Warren and more moderate Democrats like Klobuchar became striking during the course of their interviews and influenced the paper's decision to embrace candidates who embody both flanks of the party. And that's pretty much what you get in the piece. And it's also what you're seeing more broadly within the Democratic base, a tension that is most clearly aired during the presidential primary debates. What I really think happened here is that many on the editorial board, and probably the entire news team that has been kissing the feet of Elizabeth Warren wherever she walks, really wanted to endorse Elizabeth Warren, but more powerful members of the editorial board and other higher-ups don't like Elizabeth Warren and or were afraid to make themselves look like hacks for Elizabeth Warren in the wake of CNN's slip-up when they revealed to the American people that the media injects themselves in these political contestations to play kingmaker and not witness. And you can tell that this is the case because parts of the piece are mesmerized by Warren and her big ideas, and others offering a half-hearted slap at her for divisiveness, which, when it comes to divisiveness, they really don't care all too much about. Remember, for 6 decades, this paper has put their thumb on the scale in order to defend and justify some of the worst liars in American history. And this is particularly funny given that Bernie Sanders' ideas are arguably bigger and more idealistic, and is more willing to apply the divisive brute force to get them done, which is what the true believers of the socialist revolution have been preaching. But he's old, he's white, and he's not intersectional, so he's tossed by the wayside. So, with the divided editorial board trying to have it both ways, let's finally get into it. The piece starts with American voters must choose between 3 sharply divergent versions of the future. The incumbent president, Donald Trump, is clear about where he's guiding the Republican Party. White nativism at home and America First unilateralism abroad. Brazen corruption, escalating culture wars, a judiciary stacked with ideologues and the veneration of a mythological past where the hierarchy in American society was defined and unchallenged. Okay, if you're a conservative and are already tuned out to what this piece has to say, I don't blame you. They offer the same assessment of the Republican Party that they've had for every election cycle in the past 6 decades, every time endorsing a Democrat. Of course, each assessment is more hyperbolic than the last in an attempt to pull the American people out of the vice grip the right-wing conspiracy holds over the electorate. I mean, it's also funny that their Howard Zinn version of history is mythological in and of itself, but it's worded academically and it makes them feel so smart. I mean, it's why these people love Karl Marx, right? He makes them feel so smart. But, even though we want to tune them out, it's important that we go on and actually understand the left better than themselves in order to defeat them, both electorally and philosophically. So the piece goes on. On the Democratic side, an essential debate is underway between 2 visions that may define the future of the party and perhaps the nation. Some in the party view President Trump as an aberration and believe that a return to a more sensible America is possible. Then there are those who believe that President Trump was the product of political and economic systems so rotten that they must be replaced. The Democratic primary contest is often portrayed as a tussle between moderates and progressives, and to some extent that's true. But when we spent significant time with the leading candidates, the similarity of their platforms on fundamental issues became striking. Nearly all of them would be the most progressive president in decades on issues like healthcare, the economy, and government's allocation of resources. Where they differ most significantly is not the what, but the how, and whether they believe the country's institutions and norms are up to the challenge of the moment. And it goes on some ways until they say, the history of the editorial board would suggest that we would side squarely with the candidate with a more traditional approach to pushing the nation forward, within the realities of a constitutional framework and a multi-party country. But the events of the past few years have shaken the confidence of even the most committed institutionalist. We are not veering away from the values we espouse, but we are rattled by the weakness of the institutions that we trusted to undergird those values. There are legitimate questions about whether our democratic system is fundamentally broken. Our elections are getting less free and fair. Congress and the courts are increasingly partisan. Foreign nations are flooding our society with misinformation. A deluge of money flows through our politics, and the economic mobility that made the American dream possible is vanishing. Both the radical and the realist models warrant serious consideration. If there were ever a time to be open to new ideas, it is now. If there were ever a time to seek stability, now is it. That's why we're endorsing the most effective advocates for each approach. They are Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. And here's the struggle we talked about in our last episode, right? The return to normalcy camp that I summarized in Joe Biden versus the large structural change coalition under Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren played out in the pages of the New York Times. They're trying to have it both ways. Recognize this. Neither of these paths are benign. But the New York Times editorial board insists that they must either be benign or a net benefit because it deviates from what Trump and the Republican Party are doing, and therefore either is acceptable. However, if the election and the administration of Donald Trump and his own sometimes disorganized and sometimes unpredictable structural change was indeed the culmination of the conditions of the old guard, why would the New York Times insist on a return to normalcy? And if the structural change brought forth by Donald Trump was in fact destabilizing, the same sort of destabilizing that the New York Times says Bernie Sanders would bring to the Oval Office, and hence why they didn't endorse him, even though there's only a few split hairs between Warren and Sanders' policy proposals, why would they want to make that structural change larger? Why would they want to exacerbate that radical social change by electing Elizabeth Warren? And yes, while their obvious defense would be that they object to the substance and type of change Trump brings, that's not the question that's at stake here in the editorial. It's strictly one of new ideas or returning to that of the old guard. So returning to the piece, after citing Sanders' old age and health problems, the New York Times says that there's good news for the progressives that were infatuated with Bernie Sanders and the ideas he brought into the Democratic mainstream in 2016. Elizabeth Warren has emerged as a standard bearer for the Democratic left. And listen to how they start their synopsis of Elizabeth Warren. The first words out, these people, oh my goodness, the first words out of the New York Times editorial board's mouth is, Senator Warren is a gifted storyteller. Sheesh. I mean, do these people own a mayor? I saw on Twitter that Charles C. Cook, an editor over at the National Review that has slammed Elizabeth Warren over and over and over on her repetitive lying and forfeiting every interesting and unique academic position she ever held in the early 2000s in order to get into the good graces of the progressive left Democratic base, tweet out the New York Times endorsement piece of Warren and Klobuchar with the line that Senator Warren is a gifted storyteller, and these imbeciles retweeted it, not even realizing or knowing that he was mocking them the entire time. And he's mocking them because she's a habitual liar, but for the sake of saving the precious, they're glossing over that by calling her a gifted storyteller. You know, like how she told a story about her family's Native American history and how she overcame the obstacles of being a Cherokee woman to be hired at Harvard, even though she checked the Native American checkbox as her ethnicity to help her in diversity hiring. She's told stories that she was wrongfully fired for just being pregnant, despite the fact that documents prove her employer unanimously requested her to stay in her job. She's told stories and lied about her medical bankruptcy research that has been debunked several times by people like David French. She's lied about her tax plans, from the constitutionality of her wealth tax to claiming she won't raise taxes on the middle class. She's lied about her view on the markets. She's probably just lied about Bernie Sanders. I mean, it is amazing what you can get away with when you have the media on your side. The same people who fact-checked the Babylon Bee, a satire site, and everything that comes out of President Trump's mouth think Elizabeth Warren is as pure as the driven snow and spends hardly any time looking into or talking about her false claims. Alas, they and she persisted. So let's get back to the piece. So she speaks elegantly of how the economic system is rigged against all but the wealthiest Americans, and of our chance to rewrite the rules of power in our country, as she put it in a speech last month. The New York Times editorial board says that in her hands, that story has the passion of a convert, a longtime Republican from Oklahoma and a middle-class family, whose work studying economic realities left her increasingly worried about the future of the country. The word rigged feels less bombastic than rooted in an informed assessment of what the nation needs to do to reassert its historical ideals like fairness, generosity, and equality. She's also committed to reforming the fundamental structures of government and the economy. Her first commitment is to anti-corruption legislation, which is not only urgently needed, but has also the potential to find bipartisan support. She speaks fluently about foreign policy, including how to improve NATO relations, something that will be badly needed after Mr. Trump leaves office. Her campaign's plans in general demonstrate a serious approach to policymaking that some of the other candidates lack. Ms. Warren accurately describes a lack of housing construction as the primary driver of the nation's housing crisis, as she has proposed both increases in government funding for housing construction and changes in the regulatory policy to encourage local governments to allow more construction. She has plans to sharply increase federal investment in clean energy research and to wean the American economy from fossil fuels. She has described how she would reduce the economic and political power of large corporations and give workers more ability to bargain collectively. And she has proposed a sweeping expansion of government support for Americans at every stage of life, from universal child care to free public college to expanded Social Security. Ah, all her big, beautiful ideas. They're so big and beautiful. We won't dare ask her how she's going to fund all of this rampant spending, even though her wealth tax won't cover them like she claims, which we went over in one of our previous episodes and break down every single one, or nearly every single one, of Elizabeth Warren's tax plans. But the New York Times doesn't want to dirty these pristine, beautiful, pure, moonshot aspirations because they're so inspiring. Not only that, but the New York Times doesn't even seem to care how Warren goes about accomplishing these goals. Because, like they said earlier in the piece, they don't care for the Constitution or American governing principles or American institutions all too much anymore. And so they're completely fine with using the power of the executive to run roughshod over the judiciary, over the Congress, and over the American citizen. During the course of this campaign, Elizabeth Warren declared that she will use executive orders to impose a total moratorium on all new fossil fuel leases, ban fracking entirely, cancel almost all student debt, expand background checks for gun purchases, increase wages for women of color, and unilaterally reduce drug prices. The only person who was as enthusiastic as Warren about the powers of the executive was the wannabe dictator Kamala Harris before she dropped out. Seriously, that's where we that's where Elizabeth Warren is right now in her political campaign. When we've discovered that these big, beautiful ideas don't have a lot of there, and then she's been hit over the head in the media for it. And when I say media, I mean conservative media, like us over at Lone Conservative, Daily Wire, National Review, and the like. The piece goes on. American capitalism is responsible for its share of sins, but Miss Warren often casts the net far too wide, placing the blame for a host of maladies from climate change to gun violence at the feet of the business community when the onus is on society as a whole. The country needs a more unifying path. Enter Amy Klobuchar. More like Enter Sandman, because my God, I fall asleep every single time she is asked a question in the debates. It's so funny. I fall asleep and then all of a sudden I hear Bunny Thunder, and I wake right back up. So I actually have never heard her speak before. But actually, before they dive into why they support, kind of support at least Amy Klobuchar, they go through the other candidates that are perceived as moderate and explain why they didn't endorse them. They say Pete Buttigieg, the 38-year-old who served as mayor of South Bend, Indiana, has an all-star resume as a Harvard graduate, Rhodes Scholar, Navy veteran who served in Afghanistan, and the first serious openly gay presidential candidate. But he still needs to work his way up, they say. And that's a way of subtly bringing up Warren and Klobuchar's and the other candidates' club they've used against Mayor Pete. He's able to run for president because he got 8,500 votes in a relatively small town mayor election. Of Andrew Yang, they say he's an engaging and enthusiastic candidate whose diagnoses are often thought-provoking, but he has virtually no experience in government, and they say they hope he gets involved in New York politics. Now, Michael Bloomberg, of course, is a former Republican mayor who used stop and frisk and is a multi-billionaire, so, obviously he's very bad. And of Joe Biden, they say the former vice president commands the greatest fluency on foreign policy and is a figure of great warmth and empathy, which is laughable if you actually look at Biden's record on foreign policy. I mean, he has been on the wrong side of nearly every controversial foreign policy issue for the last 40 years. And after they allowed Joe Biden, the Times admits that he is prone to verbal stumbles, yes, but social media has also made every gaffe a crisis when it clearly is not. They go on to say that Mr. Biden maintains a lead in national polls, but that may be a measure of familiarity as much as voter intention. His central pitch to voters is that he can beat Donald Trump. His agenda tinkers at the edges of issues like healthcare and climate, and he emphasizes returning the country to where things were before the Trump era. But merely restoring the status quo will not get America where it needs to go as a society. What's more, Mr. Biden is 77. It's time for him to pass the torch to a new generation of political leaders. Which, again, all this is laughable, given that Elizabeth Warren is 70 freaking years old and Amy Klobuchar is nearly 60, which makes them both older than Barack Obama. I mean, this last paragraph on Joe Biden is basically an admission of what I said previously, that the New York Times and the run-of-the-mill reporter and op-ed columnist over there desperately wants to endorse Elizabeth Warren because they've mostly bought into the socialist revolution light. They admit that a return to normalcy is unfit for where we are as a country. See, the moderates over at the New York Times, just like the moderates left standing in the Democratic presidential primary, aren't really moderates. They seek incredibly progressive policies under the guise and mispackaging and mislabeling of moderation. How do I know? Because here's how they enter Amy Klobuchar. Amy Klobuchar has emerged as a standard bearer for the Democratic center. Her vision goes beyond the incremental. Given the polarization in Washington and beyond, the best chance to enact many progressive plans could be under a Klobuchar administration. The senator from Minnesota is the very definition of Midwestern charisma, grit, and stick-to-itiveness. Her lengthy tenure in the Senate and bipartisan credentials would make her a deal maker, a real one, and a uniter for the wings of the party and perhaps the nation. She promises to put the country on the path through huge investments in green infrastructure and legislation to lower emissions to achieve 100% net zero emissions no later than 2050. She pledges to cut childhood poverty in half in a decade by expanding the earned income and child care tax credits. She also wants to expand food stamps and overhaul housing policy, and has developed the field's most detailed plan for treating addiction and mental illness. And this is all in addition to a robust public option in healthcare, free community college, and a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour. Ms. Klobuchar speaks about issues like climate change, the narrowing of the middle class, gun safety, and trade with an empathy that connects to voters' lived experiences. Okay, let's be honest about the left for a second. Empathy by the left is not determined by the way you speak about the issues, which is how some might interpret this last statement that I read from the New York Times. That's a silly interpretation, and that means that these people have probably never heard her speak, her being Mrs. Klobuchar, not the author of the piece, because there really isn't any empathy there at all. I mean, let alone any other emotions. I mean, she's just completely monotone. And they probably haven't heard about the way she treats her staff, throwing binders at them and all. No, it's not how you talk about the issues. Your level of empathy by the left is determined based on the issues you talk about and your policy proposals to fix them. This sentence is more about the issues she raises, climate change, gun control, etc., and not how she raises them. Remember, these are the same folks who ripped Reagan and George H.W. Bush and the compassionate conservatives as racist and bigots because they didn't prescribe to their version of politics. So even if Amy Klobuchar throws binders at her staff, she has the right politics and thus empathy. And Donald Trump has neither. And that's really where this piece is going. Any direction. A backsliding candidate in Elizabeth Warren who was for a brief second the front runner or in second place, or someone who has struggled to make any headway in national polls and treats her staff horribly in Amy Klobuchar is better than Donald Trump. But I don't think the American people are going to buy it. And I think many people in liberal media establishments don't believe the American people are going to buy it, right? Every single time you hear after a debate, Van Jones says that he doesn't see anything up there that can even compare to what Donald Trump is going to bring to the table in 2020, especially if the economy stays the way it is. But nevertheless, the New York Times feels like they desperately need a change. And so just to give you a breakdown of the words here, they spent 996 words on Elizabeth Warren, only 677 words on Amy Klobuchar, and then they spend 188 on Sanders, 184 words on Bloomberg, 161 on Biden, 60 words on Buttigieg, and 49 on Yang. So really, as I said before, what they really want to do is endorse Elizabeth Warren, but they're scared that they are going to be outed as the kingmakers that they are. The kingmakers that they are, just like CNN was last week. All right, that does it for Bradley's breakdown. And before we move into a special Howl About That segment where I will be interviewing two individuals that work with Lone Conservative and just got back from Israel on a sponsored trip with Lone Conservative, I have to tell you about Turning Point USA. Do you attend national conferences but find it hard to personally connect with students in your area? Well, you're in luck. Turning Point USA is offering a conference just for students in the Southeast. TPUSA's Southeast Conference on March 14th and 15th is a great opportunity to hear from some of your favorite conservative leaders, just like what you'll get at the national conferences, while also connecting with local fellow conservatives. Applications will be open soon, so keep a lookout on www.tpusa.com/events for updates on the conference. Again, that's www.tpusa.com/events for updates. Before we hop into Bradley's breakdown talking about the New York Times double endorsement of two women for president, I'm going to tell you about YAF's on-campus lectures happening in the near future at colleges, hopefully near you, so you can attend for free, just like all of YAF's lectures on college campuses. So on January 28th at 7 p.m., Rachel Campos Duffy will be speaking at Florida State University in the Globe. Again, a free event, and make sure to check that out if you're in the Florida State area. Also, on January 31st at 3 p.m., Steve Forbes will be speaking at the University of South Carolina. No, I refuse to call it USC. That's not the real USC. USC's out here on my coast. But anyway, go check out Steve Forbes at the University of South Carolina on January 31st. Also, on February 3rd at 7 p.m., Alicia Krause the lovely Alicia Krause from the Daily Wire will be speaking at Texas Christian University, TCU, in Winston Scott 228. So if you are at or around any of these schools, make sure to check these free on-campus lectures out and visit www.yaf.org/events for more information. Also, if you are in the Nashville area or are interested in going to a conference, check out Young America's Foundation's Freedom Conference in Nashville on February 7th. That is at the Gaylord Opryland Resort and Convention Center. So make sure to check that out. Again, that's yaf.org/events for more information on all these campus lectures and so many more coming up as we heat up this spring 2020 semester. All right, now it is time for our Howl About segment. And this week, it's a special Howl About that segment because we have two members of Lone Conservative that actually joined the LoCo trip to Israel over the winter break, Clay Robinson and John Willow. Clay, John, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
All right, so first off, I got to get this off my... Was this everyone's first time in Israel? Was this both your first times in Israel?
It was definitely my first time. It was my first time even leaving the country, actually. I'd never flown internationally before. We had a bit of an emergency landing in Ireland, so I guess Ireland was the first country I was ever in.
What about you, Clay?
Yeah, I would say this is also my first time out of the country. Yeah, same as John. I feel like most of us on that trip, it was our first time to Israel as well.
Yeah. For me, the first time I went to Israel was in 2017. And, I'd traveled, mostly within the United States, but I lived on the West Coast. So I'd gone to Hawaii. I've done the Mexico thing. So I've been out of the country, obviously just to Mexico and Canada before, but nothing like Israel, nothing like a big Europe trip or anything like that, right? So, and obviously this is much, much different than places you may have traveled to previously within the United States. I mean, traveling to Israel is wholly different when, it's wholly different than Mexico. It's wholly different than any, trip to Rome or anything like that. It is very, very unique. What was going through your minds as you were preparing and packing up and getting ready to travel to Israel? I heard about that incident in Ireland where you guys had to have an emergency stop there. So what was going through your mind in the lead up to this trip?
Oh, I wasn't worried about the trip at all, really. I am pretty nonchalant or carefree about these types of trips, and so when I was traveling, I wasn't really packing anything special. In fact, for most of the trip, when it was pouring, I wasn't even wearing a jacket. So I just my goal in mind was to enjoy the trip as much as I could and not to worry too much about like the logistics or packing or travel or anything like that. The Ireland stuff was just kind of a fun like little detour. I got some photos of Ireland, so trip was great.
I would say that my experience is, I guess, the complete opposite of John. I'm the kind of person that forgets things, so I probably went over the packing list maybe 10 times in the least. And so, and especially being the first time out of the country, it's definitely not a place you want to forget something.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's going to a place where you don't feel comfortable with the shops, maybe it's across the country to, I'm in California, maybe it's across the country to Florida, maybe that's still not as comfortable, but when you don't even know the language, I mean, that is a whole different bear. So there's definitely different strokes for different folks, but either way, it is an absolute great time to be in the Holy Land. So just like straight off the bat, I mean, what was your biggest takeaway from the trip? I remember going in 2017 and my biggest takeaway was, my gosh, how do people continuously lie and make a villain out of Israel and out of the Israelis and out of, the way that they govern their country? I mean, really the only shining beacon of democracy within the Middle East. So what was your biggest takeaway from the trip? How about you, Clay?
I would have to say that my biggest takeaway was the day that we were in the old city of Jerusalem. I think this is the time that I mentioned to John that he wasn't wearing a sweater and it was pouring rain and it was kind of a miserable day. But I felt that in hindsight, I couldn't be miserable being in the Holy Land. Like being there was just a special experience, and I felt like even despite the weather, it was something that couldn't take away from the absolute awe that I felt while I was there.
Yeah, the old city of Jerusalem was definitely a fun day because everybody had jackets on, like rain jackets. I just had like a dress shirt, not even an undershirt on. It was just a fun day, and I was smiling the whole time. It's so hard to be sad, I think, when you're in Israel. It's such a great place. I mean, the people are probably the one takeaway that I have. the people there are just so different than they are in the United States. People tend to villainize the IDF over here, say that it's like a terrorist organization. When you're in Israel, everybody is a veteran. Everybody has served in the IDF. Everybody has a massive respect for service because it's mandatory. It's like I think 2 years for women, 2 years 8 months for men, and everybody serves. And so everybody has a massive respect for the IDF in Israel, and everybody is basically, I would say, a Republican in Israel when it comes to foreign policy. When I'm just having random conversations with just strangers on the street in Israel, they don't like the Democrats over there. They're all really really pretty conservative when it comes to foreign policy and stuff like that. And so I think that was probably my biggest takeaway is just like the people that are actually experiencing missiles being fired at their homes and how they feel about the crisis. So.
Right, that was also a huge takeaway for me, and it's something that everyone needs to keep in mind when we talk about Israeli electoral politics, like we did in 2019 throughout the summer and into the fall. And it's listen, whether it's Benny Gantz or whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu, Democrats aren't going to be pleased with the foreign policy stances they're taking, but they have literally been under the gun since their birth in the late 1940s after World War II. I mean, they've been under the gun since then, and they don't see any way forward not being under the gun in the near future. So the only response is to protect the people of Israel, the 8.7 million people of Israel living there, to be safe and protected. Despite the fact that there are rockets coming from Gaza, there's threats coming from Syria with Iran's influence, there are threats coming from Lebanon and Hezbollah and things of the sort. So that actually launches me right into what I wanted to get to. And, you guys I was looking at your schedule. You guys had some heavy days. I mean, you went to Mount Herzl and you also went to Yad Vashem on the same day, the World Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I really wanted to ask you about that experience. So going off of what John said about the way that people treat the IDF in America versus how they conceptualize the IDF in Israel. When I went to Mount Herzl, it very much gave me that same sense of pride, even as I do going to Arlington Cemetery. So, what did you guys feel when you guys went to Mount Herzl? What were some powerful stories that you saw there? And give us a view into how Israelis venerate these veterans.
Yeah, so for me personally, we had a fantastic tour guide, Marty, who would take us specifically to graves of people that he had known, and he would tell us their story, and he would humanize them a bit, and it was very touching to get these stories from him about this person who had written him letters or this person who he had known, and there were tons of rocks that people would place on the graves of just fallen soldiers that people didn't even know, and it's just to sort of say, we won't forget you. And they had this this little phrase that they would say every time they're at a grave, where it'd be like, may their memory be a blessing. And I can't remember the Hebrew for it, but it was very, very, very touching and heartwarming. And people would visit very specific graves. People would visit the graves of the prime minister who was assassinated in Israel. It's such a magnificent place. Just the way that they venerate their soldiers is just out of this world. I mean, compared to ours. It really was a touching place. It's very upkept. When people go to Birthright, there are tons of Birthright groups there, because they use it as an opportunity to show them what the IDF does there, and so they spend a lot of days there just studying, learning about the history of the IDF and what soldiers died in what conflict. And so that was probably a very, very heartfelt moment, was when Marty was telling the stories about soldiers.
Clay.
Well, and speaking of Marty's story, Marty did a fantastic job of making it not only heartfelt but also relatable. He told us a story about most of us were students on that trip or had previously been students. So he told us the story of one of the graves was about a student from the United States who came to serve in the IDF, and I think he even read us one of his letters, and it was hard not coming out of that experience a little bit more connected to the place, and definitely extremely emotional.
Yeah, I really do think that it's so important to, whenever you find yourself in the Holy Land, which for all the listeners of the podcast, I really hope all of you do get there, soon or before you pass away, because it is a amazing and powerful experience hearing these stories. And you hear a lot of anti-war talk, how war is bad, war is this, war is that, in the current geopolitical climate, but also just within American politics. We're going to be going to war with Iran, or what have you next week. But it's really, really important to realize that if no one that there's only very few countries in the history of the world that are willing to stand up for human rights, that are willing to stand up for democracy, that are willing to stand up for values that we now accept as normal values when we're talking about governance and its relationship to the individual. And those countries primarily have been the United States and have also been Israel. And so when it's given that context, there has been bloodshed around the countries of Israel and within Israel, but that blood was shed to protect what they have there, because because it really was a safe haven for Jews, after so much blood was spilled in the mid 20th century. And that kind of leads me into Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Memorial Museum. Sadly, I missed Yad Vashem when I went there on my ZOA trip in 2017. But just give us a glimpse into how Israel places the Holocaust and the events of World War II in their collective memory, and how that bleeds into their culture and their politics.
Yeah, Yad Vashem for me was probably the most harrowing experience of my entire life. I spent most of the tour just sobbing over the stories we were getting told of individuals that. So our tour guide for the Yad Vashem, her family had been in the Holocaust, and she had known rabbis who had been in the Holocaust, and she was able to tell their stories as well. I would say for how Yad Vashem, I would say settles in the Israeli consciousness. The start of Yad Vashem, the first thing you see when you walk into the actual museum is you see children singing Hatikva, which is the Israeli national anthem. These children are right before World War II. It's just a bunch. It's hundreds of kids singing, which at that time was a Zionist theme, because Jews at the time had been kicked out of every place they'd ever lived, and they truly wanted a home in Israel, back in their homeland. The way Yad Vashem is set up is it's this one long hallway that sort of details the history of the Jewish people. And it opens with this song that was made right before the Holocaust happened. And so the rest of the museum, you open with all these kids, and none of these kids lived to their teens. They all died in the Holocaust. And so that's the opening. That's what they open with, is these kids that didn't get to live their life singing the national anthem of the country you're in. And so then you go through the rest of Yad Vashem, which is it's the history of the Jewish people. Hitler comes to power. He invades Poland. Here's these camps. These Jews have to wear these stars on their arms to signify that they are Jewish. And it details all the history of the war, what goes down in all of the concentration camps. And then when you finally get to the end, one of the final rooms, Yad Vashem is actually named for a passage in Isaiah, one of the Bible passages, where it's like, not everyone will survive this war, but they will have a name that lasts forever, that endures forever. And that's Yad Vashem, a name that endures forever. And so the whole point of Yad Vashem is to get all of the names of the people that died in the Holocaust and sort of document them. And so one of the final rooms, as you see, it's completely circular, and it just has hundreds and hundreds of books filled with the names and stories of Jews that died in the Holocaust that they're able to obtain. And you can see only half of the space is full, because there's just so many names that they don't have yet, that they're still trying to uncover, that they're still trying to add to these books. And it sort of gets you a big weight of the impact of the Holocaust. And I think the final thing that you see in Yad Vashem when you exit that room is you get a beautiful skyline view of the city of Jerusalem. And like I said, Yad Vashem is meant to detail the history of the Jewish people from before the Holocaust until the end. And so the final piece of Yad Vashem is the city of Jerusalem. It's after the Holocaust, these people who, for the entire history of their people, have been kicked out of every country they've ever known, and exiled and enslaved. They finally have a home. It's just, they finally have a home. It's just like, that's the reward at the end of all of this suffering is the city of Jerusalem, is Israel. And so that moment really touched me in a way that I couldn't explain really with words, truly. The way the Yad Vashem is designed is truly beautiful.
The most impactful part about the Yad Vashem for me was the memorial outside of the Yad Vashem, dedicated to the 1.5 million children that had died in the Holocaust, and it's you go into like this cave like um, memorial thing, and in the center is a single candle, but that single candle is lit and reflected by thousands of mirrors, which causes millions of reflections of the candle, which is supposed to be every soul that was lost during the Holocaust for each child. And just being in that room and in the silence, I felt that that is extremely, it's how they see the Holocaust. It's it's just a part of their life. And I know that Cassie told us on Holocaust Remembrance Day, um, everything stops. The world stops turning for 10 minutes, and they get out of their car, they stop what they're doing, and it's like silence around the country. And I think that's just an amazing part of culture that I experienced while I was there.
Oh, it just gives me, I mean, literally I have chills right now because that was one thing that we were so bummed. I forget why we missed it, but we had it on our scheduled tour, and then something happened where we ended up being, missing our tour time, and we missed it, and everyone was just so upset that didn't come through for us. And, for me, hearing what you guys have heard and hearing where the Holocaust sits in the national consciousness, it it really is a testament to the evil of the left. And I hate to like take something, like memorizing victims of the Holocaust and then turning into a political issue, but people on college campuses, academics, professors, politicians, comparing, the current administration to the actions of Weimar Germany, and a return to 20th century Nazism and fascist thinking is just so out of touch with the reality, so out of touch with what actually occurred. Just the horrific things that occurred during the Holocaust, and it's really really important that people get to Israel in order to see that, and remember that for themselves and for their progeny, and to pass on the stories of these people who who now have a place, who now have their place in history, and it's to educate all of us on what happened in Europe in the mid 20th century. Okay, so now I want to lean less on the culture and more into the political situation in Israel. Even though as we've already noted, those are inexplicably intertwined. Even more so, that's true everywhere, but even more so in Israel, right? So you guys went to the Golan Heights. Tell us what you saw there. Why is it so important for Israel to keep holding on to the Golan Heights? Why was it so important for Trump to recognize Israel's domination over the Golan Heights?
I think more than anything, the Golan Heights is it's a huge field, and it's a series of mountains in between the field, and it's a huge. I would say, if you're looking at it from a war perspective, it's a very very tactical position to hold, for the defense of your nation, because there are so many places on mountainsides where you can have military bases, and the open fields are really like where you can do some covert operations. We discussed sort of, with our tour guide Marty, because he was previously in the IDF, some of the missions that he would go on to make sure that people don't invade the state of Israel. And so it's a huge tactical position to be able to hold, because if you want to make sure people aren't invading your country or doing covert operations, you need to be holding, these places in between the mountains, to make sure that they're not walking through anything like that. And it is a true historic area too. There are tons of areas in the Golan Heights that are historic to the history of, Western religion, and a whole like that. And so, we definitely don't want this in the hands of the Syrian government right now. And Lebanon has its own set of issues. So I think holding this is definitely something that the state of Israel has to have a vested interest in, just for the defense of the nation, especially against Syria.
Right. Imagine Israel wasn't there come 2011 when the Syrian civil war started. I mean, I was reading a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, imagine having Iran and its proxies and the Syrian government on, and as well as the terrorist influencers, or the terrorist influences that are propped up by Iran and the Iranian regime, right there on the Sea of Galilee, above, the Tiberias and the other towns that are in the area. I mean, I couldn't imagine what the situation would look like if that was the case. So thankfully, Israel has control of the Golan and has been protecting the some odd 50,000 residents that live there, both Druze, a religious minority in Syria, which they claim Syrian citizenship, as well as the Jews living there. as well. So Clay, you guys also went to Gaza. I mean, we've talked about Golan, but now take us down south. Talk to us about Gaza, what you saw there, what the political situation is, and is there any way forward to help the people of Gaza who are clearly suffering under the hand of Hamas?
Yeah, so the day we went to Gaza, we went and visited a settlement about a mile north of the Gaza Strip border, and we listened to, I want to say one of one of the members of their leadership at the settlement, and he was talking about how himself and his residents and his family, they live under the constant threat of rocket fire every single day, and that just hearing the rocket sirens is just a normal part of their life. And what was extremely admirable about their situation is that they still woke up every day with a smile on their face. There was kids playing outside. They're not letting Gaza get the best of them. And I really think that speaks to the way that Israel approaches peace with the Gaza Strip, that they're not coming from a place of aggression. Their only interest is in the self-defense of their people.
Thanks, Clay. And what about you, John?
Yeah, the fascinating thing about the town that Clay just mentioned too is everybody that's living in the city was actually evicted from the Gaza Strip by the Israeli government because they wanted to stop conflict in the Gaza Strip. And so what they did is they evicted everybody from their homes and told everybody to move further into the state of Israel for their own protection, and then they built this giant gate. And so you can see on a map where this old city that they used to live in was, and then they decided to build this town of 800 people right on the gate of where the Israeli government built the gate. And it's like, yeah, we're going to be as close to where we used to live as possible is the mantra that these people are living by. They didn't want to be evicted. They didn't want to be moved, and they're completely willing to be in the line of danger to protect their homeland. And it's one of those sort of touching moments where it's like, where we had the speech from the guy who's one in the leadership of the community. We were in a school. And from the school playground, there are like 30 kids that are below the age of, I would say, 7, playing in this cute little playground, very, very advanced facility. And you see, standing from their playground, you see 8 bomb shelters, all in walking distance. I mean, they're not even 50 yards away. You see 8 bomb shelters. Next to their basketball field, you see a bomb shelter. In their classroom, there's a bomb shelter. And it's truly one of those things where it's like, if a missile's fired from Gaza, it lands in, I think, 8 seconds was what they said. They have Iron Dome defenses nearby, but they can't always rely on it. Sometimes a missile will still hit. And so this is the life and the condition that these people are leading, and it really was a touching experience.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to, you talked about the terrain and people being connected to land. I mean, if you've studied at all South American politics, it's very, very similar and reminiscent of that, where people are very, very connected to their land, and they see the land as a way to connect to their culture, and it's very, very similar in the Middle East. So anyway, thank you both for coming on the show. I really, really do appreciate it. You guys were phenomenal. This is going to be some awesome content. We were only supposed to keep it to 15 minutes, but I went a little bit over time because John and Clay were just giving us some amazing content and a great view into what a trip to Israel looks like. And so I encourage you all to take the trip to Israel. Clay, tell us where we can find you on social media, as well as Lone Conservative. Tell us what you've been up to.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show. It was great to get to tell your audience about this experience. Like Brad said, I highly encourage anyone who hasn't yet had this experience to get there as soon as they can. You can find me at Lone Conservative on social media at Clay and Robinson. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. And I would like to add, shout out to Cassie Dillon, founder of Lone Conservative, for organizing this trip for us. We couldn't have done this without her. So, and we're also thankful to the Milstein Foundation for sponsoring, I think, almost all of us to go on this trip. So we're extremely humbled for this opportunity.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Jonathan Willow. And just to plug Lone Conservative a bit, I joined Lone Conservative a year ago. I actually had my year anniversary being in Lone Conservative while I was in Israel. So that was kind of an interesting moment. Thank you. But one of the things when I joined Lone Conservative, I didn't imagine in my wildest dreams that a year from then I would be on a trip in Israel with Lone Conservative. And you've seen some glimpses into our trip through these short stories. But we spent 9 days in the state of Israel, and I could talk for hours ad nauseum about the things we experienced there. And these are just like little glimpses into I think the important parts. And so I think joining Lone Conservative and I think going to Israel are both two life-changing experiences for me personally that I think anybody in their right mind should want to be a part of. I would not have been able to go on this trip without the funding from Milstein. So would love to say just thank you so much. It really changed my life and it meant the world to me. So thank you.
Well, there you go. Milstein, thank you so much for helping us out over at Lone Conservative. Of course, keep an eye out for John and Clay's stuff over at loneconservative.com. And if you were inspired by these stories and want to be part of the team, go to loneconservative.com, click the Apply Now button, and submit an application so that you could possibly be going to another Israel trip or something fun or like CPAC or TPUSA conference or whatever with Lone Conservative in the next year. So also, I have to say this because I've been told by the higher ups, I've been told by the higher authorities that I must say this. CPAC is coming. Lone Conservative is trying to go. If you are wanting to help out Lone Conservative by not joining the team, but by donating, go to loneconservative.com, click the donate button on the top of the screen, and it'll take you to a PayPal link. And that is how you can financially help us not only take more kids to CPAC and more kids to Israel, but also keep producing this show. Wow, that's some pretty amazing stuff from John and Clay. And the only thing better than hearing about what Lone Conservative has to offer, as well as what the Holy Land, what Israel has to offer, is possibly what the Warrior of the Week this week has to offer. We're going to be talking about veterans doing outstanding community service on MLK Day. This story comes out of Atlanta, courtesy of CBS 46. A veteran service group called the Mission Continues organizes service events in Dr. King's honor across the country on MLK Day. And on Monday, the group consisting of nearly 200 veterans as well as their friends and families got together to do just that. The group volunteered their time completing a variety of tasks to help their communities. They did everything from cutting wood to clearing bushes, even painting at the Fulton Leadership Academy, a flagship all-boys charter school that currently has a graduation rate of 100%. Veterans say the work they're doing to keep the young men in the community on a straight path makes them deserving. Veteran Kima Floneroy told CBS 46, "We joined the military because we wanted to give something back to our country, and now we're not in the military anymore, and we still want to give back to the neighborhoods we live in." That's exactly what we do. We continue the mission, and our goal is to be in areas that are underprivileged in our school and in our community, added veteran Jay Keyshawn Ballard. The volunteer event in Atlanta put on by the veteran service group The Mission Continues was also sponsored by Tyler Perry Studios and Starbucks. The group adds that giving back on MLK Day made the work they're doing a lot more rewarding, and that giving back gives them just as much benefit in return. If you've been inspired by this story, or what The Mission Continues is doing, or want to check in on the Fulton Leadership Academy, make sure to visit their websites to find more information on how you can help these vets give back to community. Thank you so much for your service, both militarily and right now in your communities. Keep doing what you're doing over at The Mission Continues. We appreciate all of your hard work over at The Elephant in the Room and at Lone Conservative, and we are happy to help you in any way, shape, or form that we can. All right, that does it for episode 9, folks. We will be back in another 2 weeks. I'm Bradley Devlin. This is The Elephant in the Room.